Your life was a hypothesis. Those who die old are made of the past. Thinking of them, one thinks of what they have done. Thinking of you, one thinks of what you could have become. You were and you will remain made up of possibilities. Your suicide was the most important thing you ever said, but you'll never be able to enjoy the fruits of this labor. Given that I am speaking to you, are you dead? Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Edouard Levé's Suicide, translated from the French by Steyn and published by, in English, Dalkey Archive. Levé was a French photographer and author who was pretty well regarded in both mediums. By 2007, he had published 4 different novels and 10 collections of photography. He was very influenced by authors like Georges Perec, and he once called his own literary style something akin to a literary cubist. He was quite prolific and was set up to be a dominant figure in both the literary and the photography worlds. But on October 15th, 2007, at just the age of 42, he took his own life. 10 days before he took his own life, he dropped off a final manuscript to his publishers. And of course, Suicide is that novel. As much as Suicide is a fictional account about a man addressing a friend who killed himself some time ago, this book is, in a significant way, I think, Levé's own public suicide note. Now, I usually don't really like autobiographical readings of books. Like most people, I think, I like them when they're interesting and useful and despise them when they're not. But here, it's really hard to separate the art from the artist. There's a line from Louise Erdrich's The Sentence, which says something like, "The life of the writer can't help but haunt the narrative." And here, it's really the death of the writer that haunts this narrative. And of course, Levé knew that this would happen. This is what happens with suicides. Their life becomes flipped, and their end becomes the beginning. And the suicide becomes the most important aspect of their life story. When you are spoken of, it begins with recounting your death, before going back to explain it. Isn't it peculiar how this final gesture inverts your biography? I've never heard a single person, since your death, tell your life story starting at the beginning. Your suicide has become the foundational act, and those earlier acts that you had hoped to relieve of their burden of meaning by way of this gesture, the absurdity of which so attracted you, have ended up simply alienated instead. This novel, I'll continue to call it a novel, as I don't think that it should necessarily just be reduced to a memoir, or just reduced to a suicide note. There is fiction here. This novel is about a man addressing his friend who some years ago killed himself at the age of 25. And so our narrator writes about his friend, this suicide, and outlines a portrait of this man. And he does this by moving between these different memories. And interestingly, this novel is told entirely in the second person, which works super effectively. The repetition of the pronoun you, I would say that most sentences in this book begin with you, is really powerful as it becomes almost like accusatory or pleading in a way. I mean, this novel is constructed as a letter for a person who will never read it. And these descriptions of these memories go beyond what our narrator remembers about this dead man, as he doesn't just depict the dead man's outer life, the stuff that our narrator would know about, but he also, in a lot of detail, depicts the dead man's inner life as well. There are tons of scenes in this book that the narrator simply couldn't have known, and you're really left questioning how our narrator knows these things. And how did he know the dead man this well? The distance and difference between the you of the second person, that of the suicide, and the implicit I of the narrator really begins falling apart quite early on. The structure of this novel is that of a fragmented sketch where we get all of these kind of incomplete fragments, these incomplete vignettes that sketch out the dead man's life. The structure of these fragments seem almost random, which, as based on what I've read of Autoportrait, one of his other works, this is really one of the ways that Levé likes to sketch out the life of a person, just allowing the randomness to shape them. But I think that this fragmentation, this brokenness, is not just a replication of how memory works, right? Memory isn't always linear, it's kind of all over the place. But it's also an aesthetic choice that maps onto how we understand history. There's a passage in here about how monuments slowly over time become ruins, and how in that way they're accidental aesthetic objects. A ruin is an accidental aesthetic object. If it becomes beautiful, this was certainly not the intention. A ruin is not constructed or maintained. The tendency of a ruin is to crumble down into a heap. The most beautiful parts remain standing, despite its wear and tear. The memory of you is what stays up, your body what subsides. Your ghost remains upright in my memory, while your skeleton is decomposing in the earth. The suicide is, in some ways, a ruin, and thus the only way to read them is to take this scattershot approach that this book takes. It doesn't ask why some memories have stayed and some memories have faded away, but simply reports those remaining memories and relate them to the reader. This book circles the ultimate question: why suicide? But it never lands on an answer. And of course, the suicide survivors don't have answers either, as they never fully do. They're always left with more questions than answers. In the opening scene of Suicide, which depicts the suicide, the man opens up a comic book to a very specific passage and leaves it on the table next to him, knowing that his wife will find him in a minute or two, and this will be his final message to her, a suicide note in some way. But when she does find him, in her justifiably uncontrollable grief, she knocks the comic book over, closing it, and thus losing the page that the man wanted her to find. And thus she never gets his final message. She never gets the answers, as we never get the answer. Those that survive him spend the rest of their lives searching for an answer. And this lack of an answer, this lack of specific reasons, makes the suicide all the more disturbing. Not providing causal reasons for this ultimate act make that ultimate act all the more confounding. And the fragmented portrait that we get in this book doesn't suggest that this man would necessarily be suicidal. All things considered, he didn't have that bad of a life, at least from what we can tell based on the narrator. But perhaps that's the point. Your life was less sad than your suicide might suggest. You were said to have died of suffering, but there was not as much sadness in you as there is now in those who remember you. You died because you searched for happiness, at the risk of finding the void. We shall have to wait for death before we can know what it is that you found, or before leaving off knowing anything at all, if it is to be silence and emptiness that awaits us. While I found this book incredibly moving and gripping, there is some idealization of suicide in this book that is, at times, I think, at best misguided and at worst, kind of dangerous. I don't know. Is it even responsible to even talk about suicide? Again, I don't know. But there are some things that I'm still grappling with this novel. The fact that Levé killed himself elevates this novel, as I'm sure he was aware that it would. And hell, it's one of the things that drew me to this book. And it's what I used in the hook of this video at the very beginning, and it's what the back of the Dalkey Archive edition uses also as a hook. So his own suicide elevates this novel in some perverse way, but at the same time it turns from fiction, from art, into something else, into scandal, into a shocking memoir, into a suicide note. And again, there isn't anything inherently wrong with scandal. Hell, I'm a big fan of Karl Ove Knausgaard, who's one of the only reasons perhaps why his books were even translated into English is because of the scandal that they created. But of course with suicide, it's much more than just a scandal. And as moving as I found the experience of reading this book, I'm left reflecting on it, feeling a bit manipulated. Like with the passage of the aesthetics of ruin. A suicide isn't quite a ruin because it is so manufactured. And there seems to be something quite different about a manufactured ruin. The description of the suicide in this book, again in the opening pages, where the suicide leaves out this comic book, he essentially manufactures a stage for his wife to find. It's so carefully constructed, and there's something so, again, meticulously manufactured about the whole thing. Just as this book itself is a kind of public suicide note, whether Levé intended that or not, though it's hard to imagine that he didn't think of the possibility of it being interpreted as such. Even with these problems though, I do think that this is a very good book, and perhaps the best book on suicide that I've read, though to be fair, I don't think I've read that many. Another one that comes to mind that is also quite good is Donald Antrim's One Friday in April. Levé's prose style is terse and restrained, and there's so much power in that. It takes this distanced and journalistic tone, simply reciting facts and events and memories, almost completely void of emotion. But it's through that restrained and compact and matter-of-fact style that Levé creates an incredibly emotional book. That contrast between the restrained prose style and the absolute magnitude of the event that it's describing, it works really well. This is a harrowing book, and not only because we know too well how it ends for Levé, but this book just probes and explores the act of suicide and the ramifications that come of it without providing any sort of answer, as any book about suicide which provided a singular answer would feel entirely disingenuous. And even though it doesn't come to any answers, it is a really engrossing, albeit extraordinarily disturbing book that if you feel comfortable reading about this subject matter, I would really recommend it. And I'm really looking forward to reading the other novels that Levé has left behind. Anyways, thanks for watching.